Good morning and many thanks to all for joining this morning's briefing on the Provisional National Accounts and International Accounts results for Q1 2024. We'll take questions at the end of today's presentations, and can I ask people to use the chat function for questions or to raise their hand if they would like to ask a question in person in the room. Today's results show GDP increasing by just under 1% in Q1 2024, with a varied picture of economic activity across M&E dominated sectors and other sectors in the quarter. This morning's briefing will take us through detail and breakdowns of the key time series to help us see what's happening with M&E activity in the quarter, and also to understand what's happening in the underlying domestic economy. Slides from the briefing will be available at the Statistical publications on cso.ie, and we hope to make a recording of today's presentations, which will be available on CSO's YouTube channel. Contact details are available on the Statistical publications and on the press release, and please contact us at any stage with any queries. I'll pass to Chris and John now to take us through the results for the national accounts and the international accounts.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll begin with the Q1 2024 national accounts. And just to say before we begin with this one, this is what we call a fifth quarter, using the base of 2022. The data is a little bit technical with this. For those of you looking at the real GDP and the growth rates, it affects the constant price data and the seasonal adjustment. And the reason I mention that is because we'll be back again in a couple of weeks with a refreshed set of data with a new 2023 base. We have detailed tables on, for example, consumption and investment in a couple of weeks. So just keep that in mind when we're looking at the data today. So I'll just begin with our infographic. So GDP up 0.9%, and on the top of the infographic shows us the sectors, the output method that contribute towards the economy. And the big message there is really about industry. Industry still holding back the GDP number, with a fall again this quarter in industry of 6.5%. The other big M&E sector, information and communications, is up 3.4%. Then the big domestic sector, distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants, up 0.9%, professional admin support services up 6.7%, and some of the other sectors are down, for example, financial, insurance and indeed construction, down 4.9%. So that mixed picture, particularly that weight of industry being down, is what gives is the real effect for the GDP result of 0.9%. If we look at the other method of measuring the economy, the expenditure method, everything is spent in the economy, we can see personal consumption on goods and services is up 0.6%. Government expenditures down 1.1%. And then we have to be a little bit careful interpreting the investment and imports data because of IP, not this quarter, but the IP that was in the intellectual property that was in the data last quarter. And I'll talk you through that through the slides. But in general, the traded sector, exports in particular, is up quite strongly, particularly around that computer services or information and communication exports. Weighing all of that up and taking in the modified investment numbers gets us on the bottom left-hand corner of the infographic, the deglobalized measure, modified domestic demand, and that's up 1.4%. So the two sides of the account, so this is the output method, and to spend a little bit of time on the industry effect here. So industry is the big blue bar on the left-hand side. Combine that with information and communication in green, gives you almost half the economy there, and that's the M&E dominated part of the data. So that blue part is down 6.5%, and that's what's giving you really the overall effect on GDP of small, positive, but moderate, I guess growth. We can look across the other sectors, and as we've seen in the infographic, information and communications up 3.4%. But then turning to the domestic sectors, we see distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants up 0.1%. Another big one, professional admin and support services, that's up quite strongly, 6.7%. But then public admin's down 0.3%. As we mentioned before, another example is construction down 4.9%. So weighing those all up is what gives us that GDP number of 0.9%. As I labour this with you each quarter, you can see in our publications the full range of data, and you can customise the view of the data in the publications to what you might like to look at. The narrative I think is worth bringing to your attention is really about two big multinational sectors and two big domestic sectors and how have they performed over time. What we're seeing clearly is this continued fall in the industry data, and my narrative around that for you would probably be to give that some time. We're comparing a really high in the industry data in 2022, and 23 was a fall from that high in 22. If we look at that data across 5 years, you'll see that we're kind of returning to 2019 levels, which in turn were up quite strongly on 18 and 17 before that. So that's really the narrative around the industry data. We're seeing the slowdown in construction value added, but then the continued increase in information and communications, I guess, with the M&E data. So you can see all those over time, and you can modify them in our publication to whatever view you'd like to look at. We can also look at some of the more high frequency data CSO produces. This is monthly industrial production, and it can tell you a little bit about some of the volatility, I guess, in this big M&E sector, particularly that spike that we saw towards the end of 2023, and the ups and downs, the cyclical pattern to that large production in 1 month and not perhaps the next. And that gives you a narrative around some of the volatility in the industry data. Similarly with services, we can look at the CSO monthly series and this on the monthly services index. We see overall it's up in each month, but particular of relevance, I guess, to us is wholesale and retail trade, along with transportation, storage, accommodation, food services. They're the ones that give us the big domestic results. Then if we weigh up all the sectors into foreign dominated and other or domestic, we'll see that it's the M&E data, again, pulled down by industry, but the domestic data is positive for the quarter. Looking at a little bit more evidence about what's going on in the different sectors, we can look at the wage bill. This is what we call compensation of employees in constant prices, seasonally adjusted, and that's up 2.7%, again, kind of reinforcing the domestic growth result. But there's some interesting things in there. If we look at something like industry there, the wage bill in industry is up 11.9%, while we see the value added in the industry sectors down. So it tells you a little bit about the domestic effect of that sector is quite positive, but the overall result is down because of some of the turnover or the valuations around some of the export data. Similarly, we can look at some of the other anomalies in there. Construction, the wage bill in construction's up quite a bit in the quarter. And then look at some of the bigger sectors, professional admin and support services. That's reinforcing the value added result. The wage bill here is up 4.8%. Again, be a little bit cautious about the Q1 data around compensation of employees. Quite often we get bonuses paid in Q1. And you'll see that in the time series. Seasonal adjustment should take care of that, but I'll just caution you a little bit about it. In particular, when we look at the shares on the next chart, the contribution of multinational firms to the economy and domestic firms to the economy. This is now standing at 36%, the contribution of foreign-owned or multinational firms to the wage bill, and 64% to the other domestic firms to the wage bill. So we have to be a little bit cautious of that one around bonus payments. You'll see a bit of a spike in Q1 each year in the total series there. If we move to the other side of the accounts, the expenditure method, everything that's spent in the economy, here we add up what's spent by individuals on personal consumption expenditure on goods and services, by government, on investment and the traded sector, exports and imports. That compared to some available European peers, and we're kind of, I guess, in the middle of the pack there. We're seeing stronger growth in personal consumption in Lithuania and Poland, while we see falls in Denmark, Estonia, Germany and Malta. So our personal consumption result maybe mirrors a lot of the domestic data, up with a small positive. It's usually around this point too that I recommend to you just remember prices. We're seeing the rate of inflation in Ireland coming down to around that 2% level, but we've had that sustained price increase over a number of years, and that's what drives that gap between these two lines. The blue line is the amount that's spent on goods and services, and the real consumption, or the green line, is what the volume of goods and services that you get. So that gap has widened, and now that the rate of inflation's come down, that gap will be maintained, I guess. So just be very conscious of that when we're looking at some of the interpretation of the personal consumption data. If you're looking for, again, background to the personal consumption data, you can look at the CSO's retail sales index produced monthly, and that'll show you some of the broad picture of particularly department stores there, books, furniture, on the background to some of the consumption data. So overall, that's what's driving our 0.6% volume growth in consumption. On the investment series, this is where the word of caution comes in again about last quarter. We had large amounts of intellectual property, so quarter-on-quarter comparisons are difficult, and hence that resulted to 40.6% fall in investment. That's really about lower intellectual property. But leaving that aside, we can look at other important measures. Building and construction down 6.1%, machinery and equipment down 1.5%. But when we adjust that data for the M&E element, taking out aircraft and IP, the adjusted capital formation is actually up 6.9%. So that 6.9% for the adjusted investment number is really what's driving modified domestic demand. Over time, that just reinforces my point there. We had that large IP in Q4 like we did in Q4 21, and we just have to be really careful about interpreting the overall investment numbers just to take account of that. Second last item on the expenditure side is government expenditure. So that's down slightly at 11.9 billion in Q1 2024. I guess the narrative around that one is we had elevated government expenditure around COVID, and government expenditure stayed high over the 22, 23, now into 24 period. And that's another important building block of GDP. The final one on the expenditure side is the traded sector, net exports. And again, the caution around this, you see the fall off in imports of services, and that's around intellectual property. So I'll probably leave the detail on that to my colleague John, who'll take you through that in the international accounts. But if we weigh up all the items on the expenditure side into a modified domestic demand contribution and the traded contribution, we see it's really the domestic data that's driving the overall GDP growth rate in Q1 2024. The last one just to mention is lower profit outflows in the quarter of 20.4 billion, giving us our GDP, our GNP growth rate of 3%. So lower profit outflows and higher net from that GNP with growth of 3%. So to finish up for me, the summary for Q1 2024, GDP up 0.9%. We have two methods to get to that. The output method tells us, well, industry's down again in the quarter, down 6.5% along with construction, but we are seeing growth in a domestic sector like distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants, up 0.9%, and a big M&E sector, information and communication, up 3.4%. Weighing all them up, the M&E sectors are down 2%, and the domestic sectors are up 1.7%. On the other side of the accounts, the expenditure method, consumption's up 6%, government expenditures down 1.1%, modified investment is down is up 6.9%, and net exports are up quite strongly as well. But it's that modified investment combined with the government expenditure and consumption that gives us that result for modified domestic demand up 1.4%. Then with those lower profit outflows in the quarter, we have GNP up 3%. Another important metric to support the domestic analysis is the wage bill or compensation of employees up 2.7%. So I'll hand over now to my colleague John Sheridan for the international accounts.
Thank you, Chris. So now I'd like to take you through the international accounts for Q1 2024. So first here we can see our infographic, which gives a really good summary of the results. We have our goods exports of 76 billion and imports of 37 billion, giving us our merchandise balance of 38.8 billion. Services exports are 103 billion and imports are 95, giving us our services balance of 7.8 billion. Income inflows are 68 billion and outflows are 92 billion, giving us our net income outflows of 24 billion euros. And these all combine to give us our current account balance of 22.6 billion euros, or 18.5% of GDP. And our international investment position at the end of March stood at minus 471 billion euros, and our stock of foreign direct investment in Ireland stood at 1.2 trillion euros. Looking at our current account balance as a percentage of GDP, we can see without the large IP imports this quarter, we're back to a more stable time series. And so for Q1 24, we have our current account balance of 22.6 billion euros, or 18.5% of GDP. Breaking that out a bit more, we have our merchandise surplus of 38.8 billion, which is down 17.2 billion on the same quarter last year. Our services balance is 7.8 billion, up 8.6 billion on the same quarter last year. And our net income outflows at 23.4 billion are down 17.6 billion on the same quarter last year. And these all combined to give us our current account balance of 22.6 billion euros, which is up 9 billion on the same quarter last year. Looking at this over time, we can see the quarters with the large negative services balances in Q4 21, Q4 22 to a lesser extent, and Q4 23, signifying large IP imports. So looking at this quarter compared to last quarter, our merchandise balance is up by 9 billion euros. Our services balance is up by 15.4 billion euros, largely driven by the differences in IP imports between the two quarters. And our net income outflows are down 1.7 billion euros on last quarter. And these all combined gives current account balance, which is up 22.9 billion on last quarter. Breaking this out a bit more, we have exports of 75.5 billion, which are down 13.5 billion on the same quarter last year, while our imports at 36.7 billion are up 3.7 billion on the same quarter last year. So we can see that the decrease in the merchandise balance is mainly driven by the decreased exports. For services, we have exports of 102.9 billion euros, which is up 19.7 billion on the same quarter last year, largely driven by increase in computer services, and imports of 95.1 billion euros, up 11.1 billion on the same quarter last year, largely driven by increases in business services. We have income inflows of 66.1 billion, which are up 19.7 billion on the same quarter last year, and outflows of 88.9 billion, up 2.2 billion on the same quarter last year. Within these, our direct investment profit and interest inflows are 19 billion euros, which are up 8 billion on last year, and outflows are 48.5 billion, down 0.4 billion on last year, with the rest of the change in primary income inflows and outflows driven by portfolio investment income and other investment income. Looking at our goods imports and exports, we can see that in Q1, our goods exports are up compared to last quarter, but down compared to last year. While on the import side, they're down compared to last quarter and up compared to last year. So while imports are up and exports are down, the decrease in exports is stronger. So the decrease in net merchandise year on year is driven by this decrease in exports. Looking at the breakdown of bulk merchandise into international trade, goods for processing and other. For the international trade exports, they're up 5.2 billion on last quarter and up 2.4 billion on last year, while our goods for processing exports are down 3.7 billion on last quarter and down 14.2 billion on last year. Merchanting, which is a net export, is down 3.1 billion on last quarter and down 0.8 billion on last year. On the import side, international trade imports are down 5.6 billion on last quarter and 2.2 on last year, while the goods for processing imports are up slightly by 442 million on last quarter and up 5.6 billion on last year. So we can see that the decrease in net exports is driven by the decrease in exports, with this driven by goods for processing. Looking at the services side and how our service exports compare to last year, we have an overall increase of 19.7 billion euros. Within this, computer services have increased by 11.4 billion. Business services are up 4.6 billion, and within this, we see an increase in operational leasing exports of 424 million. Tourism services are up 87 million, and transport services are up 196 million. So we can see that the increase in service exports is largely driven by the increase in computer service exports. Looking at the import side, we have an overall increase of 11.1 billion on last year, with business services up 3.1 billion. And within this, we have an increase in R&D of 1.3 billion and miscellaneous business services of 1.9 billion. Royalties are almost the same, down just 10 million euros. And looking a bit more closely at those royalties, we can see here the blue line gives us the total royalty imports, while the green bar gives us the amount of royalty imports related to the pharma sector. And most of the difference is related to the ICT sector. So for pharma, we can see a decrease compared to last quarter of 1.1 billion and a decrease compared to last year of 2.9 billion. While overall, we see a larger quarterly decrease of 3.4 billion and a smaller year-on-year decrease of just 10 million. So this means that quarter-on-quarter we have a decrease in ICT royalty imports, while year-on-year we have an increase in ICT royalty imports. Looking at our direct investment income, we have inflows this quarter of 19 billion euros, which are up 8 billion on last year, and outflows of 48.5 billion euros, down 415 million on last year. And these combine to give us a decrease in net direct investment income outflows of 8.4 billion euros compared to last year. Looking at compared to last quarter, inflows are up 153 million, while outflows are up 11.4 billion. And these combine to give us an increase in net direct investment income outflows of 11.3 billion euros compared to last quarter, giving us our net outflows of 29.5 billion euros. Looking at these direct investment income outflows by type, we can see that the income on debt is fairly flat as usual. We have a large increase in dividends in Q1 compared to Q4 and a corresponding large decrease in reinvested earnings. Looking at how the income breaks down by sector, we can see compared to last quarter a large increase in the manufacturing sector, which is up 11.2 billion euros, and a slight decrease in the information and communication sector, which is down 97 million. So we can see that the increase in the quarter is driven by the increase in the manufacturing sector. Year on year, we have a decrease in the manufacturing sector, down 5.1 billion euros, and an increase in the information and communication sector, which is up 2.2 billion. Looking at our current account with the UK, the trade balance with the UK is unchanged at 2.2 billion euros this quarter, and net income outflows have decreased by 3.4 billion compared with the first quarter of 23. The result is a current account deficit of 0.9 billion euros in the first quarter of 24, up 3.4 billion from the deficit of 4.3 billion in the first quarter of 23. Looking at our financial accounts, we see relatively large net transactions in the different functional categories. Direct investment abroad has increased by 15 billion euros, while direct investment in Ireland has decreased by 1.6 billion euros, giving us a net increase in direct investment of 16.5 billion euros. We have a net increase in portfolio investment of 31.4 billion and a net decrease in other investment of 35.7 billion euros. The net international investment position is minus 470.8 billion euros at the end of March 24, which is an increase of 64.2 billion on the end of December 2023. And the changes here are largely driven by non-financial corporations and other financial intermediaries. So to summarise, we have a current account balance in Q1 24 of 22.6 billion euros or 18.5% of GDP. We've an increased merchandise balance, increased services balance, and increased net direct investment income outflows. So now I'd like to pass to Paul to summarise.
Thanks, John and Chris. Just to inform you about upcoming developments, we have the annual national accounts 2023 results on the way, which is the regular annual exercise to incorporate revised data. It's a bigger exercise this year in that we have a benchmark year. So we have more data to incorporate over many more years. The BOP and national accounts will be aligned for 10 years. And that's an exercise that's happening all across Europe, which can have quite big effects in some countries. So the type of series we're incorporating in the ANA are revised enterprise statistics, large cases unit data, trade data, based indices, and other annual and revised updated sources across national accounts and international accounts. And work is also underway to incorporate the latest information from the Census of Population, Labour Force Survey, and the Household Budget Survey. And then just to repeat the headline results, which Chris has already gone through. The key quarterly indicators are an increase in gross domestic product of 0.9%, which has been driven by an increase in modified domestic demand of 1.4%, and within that, consumption has increased by 0.6%. So can we take questions in the room first? If anyone in the room has questions, can you please give your name and affiliation first, and to keep the people online informed.